What if I told you that the fate of the ancient world, who would dominate the Mediterranean, who would shape the future of Europe, and even who would lay the groundwork for modern Western civilization, was decided by a war so brutal, so relentless, that entire cities were erased from the map? And what if I told you that at the heart of this struggle stood a single man, a man whose name made Romans tremble in their sleep, Hannibal Barca? The Punic Wars were not just a clash between two cities. They were a struggle between two visions of empire: Rome, a relentless republic that refused to die, and Carthage, a wealthy maritime power whose empire stretched across seas and deserts. These wars would rage for over a century, bringing elephants over the Alps, fire to the gates of Rome, and salt to the very earth of Carthage itself. Today, we're diving into the entire history of the Punic Wars, Rome versus Carthage, and Hannibal's shadow that lingered long after the man himself. So grab your seat, because this isn't just history, it's survival, betrayal, and the birth of empire. Don't just watch, experience the war that decided the ancient world. Rome and Carthage, before the storm the Mediterranean of the 3rd century BCE, was a restless stage, a theater of trade, ambition, and blood. Before Rome and Carthage crossed swords in a war that would last generations, they lived in a tense coexistence, circling one another like predators, unsure of who would strike first. To understand how this rivalry erupted into the First Punic War, the war that would reshape the destiny of the ancient world, we have to step back into their worlds to see who they were before the storm broke. Imagine standing on the docks of Carthage around 270 BCE. The air is heavy with the scent of salt and spices. Ships creak in the harbor, their hulls swollen with riches: silver from Spain, ivory from Africa, grain from fertile plains, and exotic goods brought from lands far beyond. Towering above all is Carthage's harbor, a feat of engineering so advanced it stunned even the Romans who later saw it. There were two great harbors, one for trade, bustling with merchants, shouting in a dozen tongues, and another for the navy, a perfect circular basin where warships waited like sleeping beasts. In the center, an island headquarters allowed commanders to watch over the fleet, ensuring Carthage's power on the seas remained unchallenged. Carthage was not just a city, it was an empire woven across water. Its colonies dotted the Mediterranean from North Africa to Sardinia, Corsica, and the wealthy lands of southern Spain. It was a city of merchants, but don't let that fool you. Behind its wealth stood a war machine fueled by mercenaries: Iberian swordsmen, Numidian cavalry, Libyan spearmen. Carthaginian generals commanded them with skill, but Carthage itself rarely sent its own citizens to war. The heart of Carthage beat strongest in trade, in commerce, in wealth. Now shift your gaze eastward, across the sea, into the Italian peninsula. Rome was nothing like Carthage. Its streets were not filled with exotic goods, but with farmers, soldiers, and citizens who believed fiercely in duty. The Republic had clawed its way to dominance in Italy, defeating Samnites, Etruscans, and Greek colonies like mighty Tarentum. Its armies were not mercenary forces bought with coin. They were citizens, farmers who laid down their plows to take up spears and shields. Men who fought because the Republic demanded it, and who returned home to rebuild when the campaign ended. Rome's military might lay not only in discipline but in structure. The Manipular Legion was revolutionary, flexible blocks of soldiers that could adapt on the battlefield, where other armies rigid, slow, unwieldy would break. Rome also had something else, something even more powerful than strategy or weapons. Rome had determination, a kind of stubbornness so profound that defeat was never final. A Roman army could be annihilated in one battle, and yet, within months, another would rise in its place. Rome refused to die, so here stood two powers, one rich from the seas, the other hardened on land. At first, they had little reason to clash. Rome's ambitions were focused on Italy, while Carthage's empire was maritime. For a time, they even worked together, When Pyrrhus of Epirus, one of the greatest generals of the age, brought his war elephants to southern Italy, threatening Rome, Carthage offered aid. They shared a common enemy then, but alliances, born of convenience, are fragile. And once Pyrrhus was gone, Rome and Carthage looked at each other differently. The spark that set them on the path to war came from a place neither side expected. The island of Sicily. Sicily, the jewel of the Mediterranean. Sicily was the richest prize in the Mediterranean. Its soil was fertile, its cities wealthy, and its position unmatched. Whoever controlled Sicily could dominate trade routes between east and west. For centuries, the island had been a battleground between Greek settlers and Carthaginian forces. Carthage controlled the western portion of Sicily, with strongholds like Lilybaeum, while Greek city-states like Syracuse dominated the east. It was a delicate balance of power, and both Rome and Carthage had kept their distance, wary of plunging into a conflict that might bleed them dry. But in 264 BC, a seemingly minor conflict ignited into a war that neither side could resist. In the small city of Messina, a band of mercenaries known as the Mamertines seized control. They found themselves caught between Carthage and Syracuse, desperate for protection. First, they appealed to Carthage, and Carthage accepted, stationing troops to guard the city. But then, perhaps fearing Carthage's control, they turned to Rome. Rome faced a dilemma: intervene in Sicily, or allow Carthage to tighten its grip. The Senate debated fiercely. Some argued Sicily was beyond Rome's concern, but others saw the danger clearly. If Carthage held Messina, they could dominate the Straits of Messina, the narrow passage between Sicily and Italy. That would put Carthage directly at Rome's doorstep. In the end, Rome chose to act. They sent legions across the strait. It was a decision that changed history. For the first time, Rome had left the Italian peninsula to fight on foreign soil. For the first time, Rome and Carthage would stand as enemies, face to face. Rome learns the Scythian War that followed would last 23 years, the First Punic War, the longest continuous conflict of the ancient world up to that time. But in its opening stages, Rome faced a staggering problem. Carthage was a naval power, supreme on the seas. Rome had no fleet worth mentioning. How could a land power challenge the mistress of the Mediterranean? Here is where Rome's determination revealed itself. Instead of accepting naval inferiority, the Romans decided to build a navy from scratch. According to legend, they captured a Carthaginian ship and used it as a model. Within 60 days, the Romans constructed a fleet of over 100 warships. But even with ships, Rome lacked experience. Carthaginian sailors had grown up on the sea. Roman crews were farmers and citizens who had never fought on water. To overcome this, the Romans invented something new: the corvus, a massive boarding bridge with a spike on the end. When Roman ships closed with the enemy, the corvus would slam down onto the Carthaginian deck, locking the two ships together. Suddenly, a naval battle became a land battle, fought on water, exactly the kind of fight Romans excelled in. With this innovation, Rome turned their weakness into strength. The results shocked Carthage. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, Rome won its first major naval victory, capturing or sinking dozens of Carthaginian ships. For the first time, Carthage realized Rome was no ordinary foe. Carthage strikes back, but Carthage was not about to be humbled easily. Their admirals adapted, avoiding the corvus and using their superior seamanship to strike back. The war raged across Sicily, with brutal sieges and grinding campaigns that bled both sides. Cities were taken and retaken, armies destroyed and rebuilt. One of the fiercest battles came at the siege of Agrigentum in 262 BCE. Rome brought a massive army, determined to break Carthaginian power on the island. The Carthaginians resisted fiercely, and when relief forces arrived, the battle turned into a slaughter. But Rome prevailed, capturing the city after months of starvation and bloodshed. It was a grim sign. Rome would not be deterred by cost, time, or suffering. The war dragged on, shifting from land to sea and back again. Carthage, for all its wealth, began to struggle. Hiring mercenaries drained its treasury, and the loyalty of those mercenaries was never certain. Rome, meanwhile, poured its citizen soldiers into the conflict. Generation after generation, driven by an iron will to finish what they had started. Toward the climax, the First Punic War became a war of exhaustion. Neither side would yield, and Sicily became a graveyard for tens of thousands of men. Rome launched bold expeditions, even daring to invade North Africa in 256 BC, where they won a stunning victory at the Battle of Adys only to suffer disaster soon after, when Carthaginian general Xanthippus crushed them near Tunis. The survivors staggered home. Yet Rome did not surrender. Year after year, fleets were built, destroyed, and built again. At one point, storms annihilated hundreds of Roman ships, drowning tens of thousands of men. Any other power would have given up. Rome built another fleet. It was as though the Republic had an endless reservoir of will, fueled not by wealth, but by the sheer stubbornness of its citizens. Finally, after more than 2 decades, the end came at the Battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE. Rome's rebuilt fleet, manned by citizen crews, hardened by endless war, cornered the Carthaginian navy. The Romans rammed, boarded, and overwhelmed their foes. Carthage, exhausted and bankrupt, sued for peace. The terms were brutal. Carthage surrendered Sicily, paid a crushing indemnity, and watched as Rome stepped onto the stage of the Mediterranean as a naval power. For Carthage, it was a humiliation. For Rome, it was a triumph, but one that came at unimaginable cost. Reflection, the shadow of future wars. The First Punic War had reshaped the ancient world. Rome had proven itself unstoppable, able to fight on sea as well as land, able to endure losses that would have broken other nations. Carthage had suffered defeat, but it was not destroyed, and in the bitterness of that defeat, seeds were planted, seeds that would grow into the fury of Hannibal Barca, a man who would one day make Rome tremble. For now, the Republic rejoiced, its citizens proud, its legions triumphant. Yet Rome had no idea that the war just ended was only the beginning. The Punic Wars were not over. They had only begun, and the most terrifying chapter, the chapter of Hannibal, was still to come. Hannibal rises when the First Punic War finally ended in 241 BCE. Carthage was a wounded beast. 23 years of relentless struggle had drained its coffers, broken its pride, and left scars on its people. The empire that had once ruled the waves now bent under the crushing weight of Rome's demands, a massive indemnity in silver, the loss of Sicily, and humiliation before its own allies. Yet if Rome thought the war had settled the matter once and for all, they misunderstood the Carthaginian spirit. Out of Carthage's defeat would emerge a man whose name would echo through history as the embodiment of Rome's greatest fear, Hannibal Barca. But Hannibal's story does not begin with him. It begins with his father, Hamilcar Barca, the Lion of Carthage. Hamilcar's revenge. Hamilcar had fought Rome until the bitter end of the First Punic War, commanding Carthaginian forces in Sicily with brilliance and ferocity. He was no stranger to defeat, but he was also no stranger to resilience. Even as Carthage's Senate sued for peace, Hamilcar seethed. He had not lost faith in his cause. To him, Rome was not a rival to respect, but a mortal enemy destined to be destroyed. When the war ended, Carthage faced chaos at home. The state was nearly bankrupt, and when it tried to cut costs by underpaying its mercenary soldiers, those mercenaries rebelled. What followed was the mercenary war, one of the most brutal civil conflicts of antiquity. For 3 years, Carthage fought not against Rome, but against its own former allies. Mercenaries who rampaged across North Africa in fury, joined by Libyan cities, eager to throw off Carthaginian rule. The war was so savage it became known as the Truceless War, a war without mercy, where neither side took prisoners. Hamilcar led Carthage through this nightmare, relentless, cunning, and merciless. When needed, he crushed the rebellion city by city, until Carthage was once again secure. Yet victory only deepened his hatred of Rome, while Carthage licked its wounds. Rome had seized not only Sicily, but also Sardinia and Corsica, taking advantage of Carthage's weakness. To Hamilcar, this was a theft too far, an insult that could never be forgiven. If Carthage was to rise again, it would not be by contesting Rome in the seas where she had triumphed. Hamilcar looked westward, to Spain. Spain. The new Carthage Spain was a land of opportunity, rich in silver mines, fertile fields, and fierce warriors. By conquering and colonizing Spain, Carthage could rebuild its wealth, strengthen its armies, and prepare for the day when vengeance could be unleashed upon Rome. Hamilcar led Carthaginian armies into Iberia, forging alliances with local tribes, crushing resistance where he had to, and establishing a new base of power far from Rome's immediate reach. It was in Spain, amid the dust of campaigns and the clang of weapons, that young Hannibal grew up. As the legend goes, when Hannibal was only 9 years old, his father brought him before an altar, placed his tiny hand upon a sacrifice, and made him swear an oath never to be a friend of Rome. Whether this scene happened exactly as the legend tells, no one can say, but there is no doubt that Hannibal grew up with Rome as the dark shadow against which his entire life was measured. Hamilcar was not alone in this endeavor. With him were his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair and, later, his sons Hasdrubal, Barca, and Hannibal. Together, the Barca family carved out a Carthaginian empire in Iberia, one built not only on conquest, but also on shrewd diplomacy. Carthage rebuilt its power, coin by coin, sword by sword. But even as Carthage rose in Spain, Rome watched with wary eyes. The Republic had no desire to see its old enemy grow strong again. Rome sent envoys, demanding assurances, and eventually an agreement was struck, the Ebro Treaty. Carthage promised not to cross the river Ebro in Spain, setting a boundary between their new empire and Roman interests. For a time, it seemed peace might hold, but peace was never destined to last. Hannibal takes commanding to 29 BCE. Hamilcar died in battle, drowned in a river as he fought Iberian tribes. Leadership of Carthaginian Spain passed to his son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, who continued his policies and expanded Carthage's influence with a mixture of diplomacy and power. But in 221 BCE, Hasdrubal was assassinated, leaving Carthage's armies leaderless. The soldiers, without hesitation, turned to Hannibal. He was only in his mid-20s, but already he had proven himself in command. Charismatic, fearless, and brilliant, he had the loyalty of his men and the blood of Hamilcar in his veins. The Senate in Carthage confirmed his appointment, and with that, the stage was set. Hannibal Barca was now master of Spain. From the beginning, Hannibal displayed the qualities that would make him one of history's greatest generals. He was ruthless in war, but also masterful in gaining the loyalty of allies. He understood the importance of both fear and respect, of rewarding those who stood by him and crushing those who defied him. His army was a mosaic of cultures: Iberians, Libyans, Numidians, Balearic slingers, and, eventually, even war elephants. To Hannibal, this diversity was not a weakness but a strength. He knew how to turn men of different tongues and customs into a single fighting machine. But what set Hannibal apart most of all was his vision. He did not simply want to defend Carthaginian Spain. He wanted to destroy Rome. The spark at Saguntum, the fragile peace between Rome and Carthage, rested uneasily on the Ebro Treaty. South of the river lay Carthage's sphere, north of it Rome's. But on the border stood the city of Saguntum, a Roman ally, though not technically within the treaty's boundary. To Hannibal, Saguntum was a provocation. To Rome, it was a test, In 219 BCE, Hannibal laid siege to Scipio. For 8 long months, the city resisted, calling desperately to Rome for help. But Rome hesitated. Sending an army into Spain would take time, and the Senate was divided. By the time a decision was reached, it was too late. Hannibal's forces stormed the city, slaughtered its defenders, and claimed victory. The fall of Saguntum was the spark that ignited the Second Punic War. Rome demanded Hannibal's surrender. Carthage refused. War was declared. But Hannibal was already moving, already planning a campaign so bold it would leave Rome reeling in shock. The march across the Alps. Hannibal knew he could not fight Rome on Roman terms. If he marched his armies by sea, Rome's navy would crush him. If he stayed in Spain, Rome could isolate him. So he chose a plan that seemed impossible. He would march his army overland, through Gaul, across the Alps, and into Italy itself. It was a gamble no one else would have dared. The Alps were a nightmare of jagged peaks, freezing snow, and hostile tribes. The journey would test even the hardiest soldiers. Yet Hannibal believed that by bringing war directly into Italy, he could rally Rome's enemies, break their alliances, and destroy the Republic's power at its heart. In the spring of 218 BCE, Hannibal set out with an army of perhaps 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and nearly 40 elephants. They marched through Spain, crossed the Ebro, and swept into southern Gaul. Roman forces scrambled to intercept him, but Hannibal outmaneuvered them, slipping past and driving his men relentlessly toward the Alps. The crossing itself was an ordeal of mythic proportions. Men and animals perished by the thousands. Avalanches buried soldiers alive. Tribes ambushed them from the cliffs. Supplies ran short, and the army staggered in the thin mountain air. Yet Hannibal himself never faltered. Riding alongside his men, enduring the same hardships, he inspired them to keep moving. Against all odds, they emerged from the mountains into the plains of northern Italy, fewer in number, battered but alive, and ready for war. Reflection: a storm over Italy. When word reached Rome that Hannibal had crossed the Alps, panic spread like wildfire. It was unthinkable. No foreign general had dared to invade Italy since Pyrrhus, and Pyrrhus had brought only a fraction of the force Hannibal now commanded. The Republic braced itself, marshalling its legions, but nothing could prepare them for what was to come. Hannibal had fulfilled his father's dream. He had brought the fight to Rome, not at the edges of empire, but at its very heart. And in the years that followed, he would deliver Rome some of the greatest defeats in its history, battles that would haunt the Republic for generations. The Second Punic War had begun, and its opening act would soon give rise to blood-soaked legends, Trebia, Trasimene, and the most devastating of Alcani. Rome trembles, Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae. When Hannibal emerged from the frozen jaws of the Alps in 218 BCE, his army was battered but unbroken. Perhaps half his men had perished along the way, along with many of his elephants. The survivors were gaunt, frostbitten, and weary. Yet what they had accomplished was nothing short of miraculous. Hannibal had done the impossible. He had crossed the natural barrier Rome had believed impenetrable, and now, standing on Italian soil, he was ready to ignite a fire that would rage for over a decade, for Rome. The nightmare had just begun. The first clash, Trebia, river, the Romans, stunned by Hannibal's audacity, quickly mustered their legions to confront him. The Senate sent Tiberius Sempronius, a fiery commander eager for glory, to join Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had already engaged Hannibal near the Rhine. Together, their armies formed a massive force intent on crushing the invader before he could gain a foothold. Hannibal, however, had no intention of fighting on Rome's terms. He chose his battlefield carefully along the icy banks of the Trebia River in December 218 BCE. The winter was harsh, the waters bone-chilling, and Hannibal saw an opportunity to turn nature into his ally. Before dawn, he sent his brother Mago with a hidden detachment of cavalry and infantry to lie in ambush in a hollow by the river. Then, provoking the impulsive Sempronius, he drew the Roman army across the frigid waters. Hungry, cold, and soaked to the bone, the legionaries stumbled into Hannibal's trap. The Carthaginian cavalry, swift Numidian horsemen, smashed into the Roman flanks. As the legions struggled, Mago's hidden force surged from their hiding place, attacking from behind. The Roman army collapsed into chaos. Thousands were cut down, others fled, and Hannibal stood victorious. The Battle of Trebia was Rome's first encounter with Hannibal in Italy, and it ended in disaster. Yet it was only a taste of what was to come. The Lake of Shadows Trasimene the next year, 217 BCE, Hannibal pressed deeper into Italy. His goal was not merely to defeat Rome in battle, but to unravel the web of alliances that bound Italy together under Roman dominance. If he could destroy Rome's armies and prove Rome could not protect its allies, perhaps the cities of Italy would join him. The Roman Senate, desperate to stop him, gave command to Gaius Flaminius, a man known for his rashness. Flaminius, burning with the need to defend Rome's honor, chased Hannibal without caution. Hannibal led him northward, toward the mist-shrouded waters of Lake Trasimene. There, he prepared one of the greatest ambushes in military history. Picture the scene: the lake on one side, rolling hills on the other, and a narrow road between. Hannibal placed his troops in concealment along the hillsides, hidden by fog and terrain. As Flaminius marched his legions along the road, Hannibal struck. Suddenly, horns blazed. Carthaginian soldiers poured down from the slopes, crashing into the Roman column from the high ground. Panic rippled through the legionaries, trapped between lake and hills, unable to form their lines. Horses screamed, men drowned in the waters, and Flaminius himself was cut down, fighting desperately to rally his men. It was annihilation. Over 15,000 Romans were killed, thousands more captured. It was one of the largest ambushes in recorded history, and Rome was left reeling. The news hit the city like a thunderbolt. Hannibal was no longer a distant threat. He was an unstoppable predator inside Italy itself. Fear gripped Rome. Whispers spread of omens and curses of gods turning against the Republic. But Hannibal was not finished. His masterpiece was yet to come. Cannae, the day Rome almost did in to 16 BCE. Rome raised the largest army it had ever fielded, over 80,000 men. This was no mere campaign. It was a crusade to rid Italy of Hannibal once and for all. The consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, led the host. Their strategy was simple: crush Hannibal with sheer numbers. Hannibal, with perhaps 50,000 men, faced impossible odds. But where Rome saw numbers, Hannibal saw opportunity. He understood that the Romans, confident in their size, would attack head, and he had prepared a trap so elegant, so terrifying, that it would enter military legend forever. On the plain of Cannae, Hannibal arranged his army in a crescent formation, with his weaker Iberian and Gallic troops at the center, his Africans on the flanks, and his cavalry at the wings. As the massive Roman army advanced, they smashed into Hannibal's center, pushing it back. The crescent bent inward, slowly, deliberately, like a bowstring drawn tight. Meanwhile, Hannibal's cavalry routed the Roman horsemen on both flanks and swung behind the Roman infantry. Then, as the Roman center surged forward, Hannibal's African troops on the flanks pivoted inward, closing the trap. The Romans found themselves encircled, hemmed in on all sides. What followed was slaughter. Packed tightly, unable to maneuver, the Roman legions were butchered where they stood. The killing went on for hours, until the fields of Cannae were heaped with corpses. Estimates suggest 50,000 to 70,000 Romans were killed in a single day. Consuls, senators, officers, soldiers. It was one of the greatest defeats in Roman history, and one of the bloodiest days in all of antiquity. For Rome, It was almost the end. The aftermath, Rome's darkest hour. News of Cannae devastated the Republic. Families wept in the streets, temples filled with supplicants, and fear gripped even the Senate. Allies wavered. Cities in southern Italy, including the mighty Capua, defected to Hannibal's side. Macedon and Syracuse joined him as well, eager to strike at Rome while she bled. Hannibal seemed unstoppable, a phantom of death who could not be defeated, and yet Rome did not surrender. Any other state would have begged for peace, sued for mercy. But the Romans did the unthinkable. They raised more legions, conscripted more men, and swore never to negotiate, while Hannibal remained on Italian soil. The Republic turned its fear into fury. Still, Hannibal lingered like a shadow across the land. He wintered in Capua, recruited allies, and roamed Italy undefeated. For over a decade, he remained Rome's greatest terror, haunting their fields, burning their farms, killing their sons. Hannibal had brought Rome to the edge of destruction, but whether he could finish the job, that was the question history would answer. Reflection. The shadow of Cannae was more than a battle. It was a scar burned into Rome's memory, a wound that never fully healed. For centuries, Roman generals would use the phrase, the Cannae strategy, to describe the perfect encirclement, the ideal victory. And for centuries, Romans would whisper Hannibal's name as the nightmare who had brought them to the brink. But even as Hannibal stood victorious, his greatest challenge loomed. He had shattered Rome's armies, but he had not broken Rome itself. The Republic still lived, still plotted, still fought, and soon, a new generation of Romans would rise led by a young commander whose destiny would be to face Hannibal himself, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus. The stage was set for the next act in this epic struggle. The war was not over. It was only entering its most dangerous phase. Scipio rises. The turning tide of war. The smoke of Cannae still hung over the fields of southern Italy, and the ground was heavy with Roman blood. For most powers of the ancient world, such a catastrophe would have been the end. But Rome was not like other powers. Instead of collapsing, the Republic grew more dangerous, like an animal wounded but not slain. Hannibal had delivered the most crushing defeat in Rome's history, yet he had not broken Rome's spirit. And in the years that followed, Rome would show the world why it was destined to rule. Rome refuses to die after Cannae. The logical move for Hannibal would have been to march on Rome itself. Many of his officers urged him to strike the city, to finish the Republic once and for all. But Hannibal refused. Some historians argue he lacked the siege equipment to breach Rome's mighty walls. Others believe he expected Rome's allies to defect en masse, crumbling the Republic from within. And indeed, some cities did turn. Capua, the second city of Italy, opened its gates to Hannibal. Syracuse and Sicily defected. Macedon pledged support. For a moment, it seemed Hannibal's strategy might succeed. Yet Rome refused to yield. Instead, the Senate declared a policy of attrition. They would avoid open battle against Hannibal, refusing to be drawn into another Cannae. The man tasked with this strategy was Quintus Fabius Maximus, nicknamed Cunctator, the Delayer. Fabius shadowed Hannibal's movements, cutting his supplies, harassing his allies, but never engaging in pitched battle. His caution earned criticism from Romans hungry for revenge, but in time, his patience proved wise. Hannibal remained undefeated, but he was also unable to strike the killing blow. Rome bled, but it endured. The war spread while Hannibal roamed Italy. Rome turned its attention elsewhere. Carthage's strength lay not only in Hannibal, but in its empire, Spain, Sicily, Africa. To defeat Carthage, Rome needed to strike those strongholds. In Sicily, Rome laid siege to Syracuse, which had defected to Carthage. The city was defended by none other than Archimedes, the great mathematician and engineer who devised ingenious war machines to repel Roman attacks. His inventions, giant catapults, claw-like cranes, and even mirrors, set to set ships ablaze, held the Romans at bay. But eventually, in 212 BCE, Syracuse fell. Archimedes himself was killed, despite orders to spare his life. With Sicily secured, Rome tightened its grip on the Mediterranean. In Spain, the struggle was fiercer still. Carthage's armies, commanded by Hannibal's brothers Hasdrubal and Mago, fought desperately to hold their ground. For years, Rome sent generals to Spain, only to see them defeated or killed. Among those killed were the father and uncle of a young Roman officer named Publius Cornelius Scipio. It was their deaths that propelled him into command and into history. The rise of Scipio was only 25 when he was given command in Spain, a staggering responsibility for a man so young. Yet from the start, he displayed brilliance to match Hannibal's own. Charismatic, bold, and deeply religious, Scipio inspired his men with a sense of destiny. Where others saw Hannibal's genius as insurmountable, Scipio believed Rome could match it and surpass it. In 209 BCE, Scipio struck at Carthage's most important stronghold in Spain, New Carthage, modern Cartagena. With a daring amphibious assault, he captured the city, seizing treasure, hostages, and supplies. It was a devastating blow to Carthage's power in Iberia. Scipio then forged alliances with local tribes, winning their loyalty through diplomacy and respect. He proved himself not only a commander of armies, but a builder of coalitions, exactly the skill Rome needed to counter Hannibal's strategy. One by one, Carthage's holdings in Spain crumbled. At the Battle of Baecula, in 208 BCE, Scipio defeated Hasdrubal Barca, forcing him to retreat. The following year, Hasdrubal attempted to march to Italy to reinforce his brother, but at the Battle of the Metaurus in 207 BCE, Roman forces intercepted him. Hasdrubal was killed, his head hurled into Hannibal's camp as a grim message. No help was coming. For Hannibal, the loss was catastrophic. His dream of uniting his family's forces in Italy died with Hasdrubal. For Rome, it was the beginning of hope, the war of attrition even, as Rome gained victories abroad. Hannibal remained undefeated in Italy. For over a decade, he moved like a phantom, striking Roman armies, raiding the countryside, wintering in Capua or Apulia. Rome could not catch him, but Hannibal could not break Rome. It was a stalemate, one that drained Carthage more than it drained the Republic. Carthage's reliance on mercenaries left it vulnerable to shortages of coin and loyalty. Rome, meanwhile, drew endlessly from its citizen base. The Republic's resilience was astonishing. Even after losing tens of thousands at Cannae, it fielded new armies year after year. For every defeat, Rome raised another legion. For every city that defected, Rome tightened its grip on the others. Slowly, inexorably, Hannibal's brilliance began to dim against the sheer weight of Rome's determination, and Scipio was not. Don Scipio single quotes as vision by 206 BCE, Scipio had completed the conquest of Spain, driving the Carthaginians out entirely. He returned to Rome, a hero, his reputation soaring. Yet he did not rest on his laurels. He had a bold new plan, to carry the war to Africa itself, to strike Carthage in its homeland. It was a daring proposal. Many senators opposed it, fearing Hannibal still lurked in Italy, too dangerous to ignore. But Scipio argued passionately that the only way to end the war was to force Carthage to recall Hannibal, to confront him not on Roman soil, but on African ground. The Senate relented. Scipio was granted command. The stage was set for the final act of the Second Punic War. Hannibal called home in 204 BCE. Scipio landed in North Africa with a Roman army. He forged alliances with Numidian leaders, securing their famed cavalry, the very same cavalry that had once terrorized Rome under Hannibal's command. With these new allies, Scipio struck deep into Carthaginian territory, defeating its forces and threatening the city itself. Carthage, desperate, recalled Hannibal. After more than 15 years in Italy, the great general prepared to leave the land where he had brought Rome to its knees. His Italian allies wept at his departure. His enemies breathed a sigh of relief. For Hannibal, it was a bitter moment. He had come so close to victory, yet now he was forced to abandon his dream. In 202 BCE, Hannibal returned to Africa. There, on the plains near a town called Zama, he would face Scipio, the man the Romans now called Africanus, to titans, to visions, to empires destined to clash in one final, decisive battle. Reflection, a war's turning point. The rise of Scipio marked the turning tide of the Second Punic War. From the ashes of Cannae, Rome had clawed its way back, proving its resilience unmatched. Hannibal had been Rome's greatest terror, but Scipio was Rome's answer, a general who combined Roman discipline with Hannibal's audacity. As the two prepared to meet at Zama, the world held its breath. Would Carthage rise from its wounds, or would Rome crush its greatest enemy once and for all? The Punic Wars were entering their climax, and the fate of the Mediterranean hung in the balance. Zama, the fall of Carthage, and Hannibal's shadow. The year was 202 BCE. For over a decade and a half, Hannibal Barca had haunted Italy like a specter, undefeated in open battle, feared even in Rome itself. Mothers still whispered his name to frighten children. Senators still debated how to rid themselves of him, and soldiers marched into war with the memory of Cannae carved into their minds. Yet now, as fate would have it, Hannibal stood not in Italy, but in Africa, preparing to face Rome's new champion. Two worlds, two legacies, were about to collide on the plains of Zama, the meeting of rivals before battle. Legend tells us Hannibal and Scipio met face, two of the greatest commanders in history, each in the prime of his power, spoke together in a parley that has become immortalized. Hannibal, seasoned by decades of war, offered peace on moderate terms, but Scipio, confident in Rome's rising fortune, demanded total surrender. Carthage must give up Spain, its fleet, and its empire. Hannibal listened, but he knew his city would not accept such humiliation without a fight. The parley ended as the two men parted. Perhaps each recognized something of himself in the other, mirror image of ambition, courage, and destiny. But history allows no equals. One would emerge victorious. The other would be cast into shadow. The Battle of Zama, the morning of the battle. Hannibal's army stood arrayed across the plain. It was a diverse host, mercenaries in the front, Carthaginian citizens and allies behind, and his hardened veterans of Italy at the rear. Most dramatic of all, he deployed around 80 war elephants. Those thunderous beasts meant to terrify and scatter the Roman legions. Scipio, however, was ready. His men had trained to open lanes in their ranks, allowing the elephants to charge harmlessly through, while javelins and horns panicked the animals. When the elephants thundered forward, many turned back in confusion, trampling their own lines. The rest were funneled harmlessly past the Roman soldiers. Hannibal's opening gambit had failed. Then came the infantry clash. The mercenaries in Hannibal's front line fought fiercely, but when pressed back, they expected support from the second line. Instead, resentment brewed. Carthaginian citizens were reluctant to help mercenaries who had cost them so much. The lines fractured. Only Hannibal's veterans, those battle-scarred survivors of Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, stood firm, halting the Roman advance in a desperate struggle. But Scipio had his own advantage. The Numidian cavalry, under Massinissa, once Hannibal's allies, now Rome's, while the infantry lines ground against one another. The Numidians and Roman cavalry routed Carthage's horsemen and swept around the rear. It was the mirror image of Cannae, but this time, it was Rome who encircled Carthage. The veterans fought to the last, but the battle was lost. Carthage's army lay shattered. Hannibal himself escaped the field. But the war was over. The end of the Second Punic War. Carthage sued for peace. And this time, Rome dictated terms without mercy. Carthage surrendered Spain, its fleet, and its independence in foreign affairs. Heavy indemnities were imposed. shackling the once great city. Carthage was spared destruction for now, but it was no longer an empire. It was a humbled client, existing only at Rome's pleasure. In Rome, the victory was celebrated as destiny fulfilled. Scipio was hailed as Africanus, the conqueror of Carthage. Statues were raised, triumphs paraded, and his name entered the pantheon of Rome's greatest heroes. For Hannibal, the defeat was devastating. He had carried his father's dream across mountains and rivers, won victories against impossible odds, and nearly destroyed Rome itself. Yet in the end, even his genius could not overcome Rome's resilience. Hannibal, in exile, though defeated, Hannibal was not yet finished. Returning to Carthage, he entered politics, reforming the city's government, stamping out corruption, and restoring its finances. For a time, he gave his people hope, but Rome, ever fearful of his shadow, demanded his exile. So Hannibal wandered the Mediterranean, offering his services to kings and generals. In the court of Antiochus, the third of the Seleucid Empire, he urged resistance against Rome. In Bithynia, he advised rulers on strategy. Always, Rome's envoys followed him, demanding his surrender, fearing his return. Hannibal became a man without a homeland, hunted by the very enemy he had once terrified. At last, cornered and facing capture, Hannibal chose his own fate. Taking poison, he ended his life with the words, "Let us now put an end to the long anxiety of the Romans, who have thought it too long, too heavy, to wait for the death of one old man, even in death." Hannibal refused to let Rome decide his end. The Third Punic War, but the Punic Wars were not yet finished. Half a century later, Rome, still haunted by memories of Hannibal, turned once more on Carthage. Despite having abided by Rome's harsh terms, Carthage was accused of threatening Roman allies. In 149 BCE, the Senate declared war against the Third Punic War. This was no war of strategy or generals, but of annihilation. For 3 years, Rome besieged Carthage, pounding its walls, cutting off its supplies. The Carthaginians fought with desperate courage, even forging weapons from household tools. But Rome would not be denied. In 146 BCE, Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, stormed the city. Carthage was burned, its people sold into slavery, and its lands cursed with salt. The city that had once rivaled Rome was erased from the map. The Punic Wars were over. Rome stood supreme. Reflection, Hannibal's shadow, and, yet though Carthage was gone, Hannibal's shadow remained. Roman generals studied his tactics for centuries. His encirclement at Cannae became the gold standard of battlefield maneuver. His name endured as both a warning and a legend, even in Rome. He was admired as the greatest foe the Republic had ever faced. The Punic Wars had decided more than the fate of 2 cities. They had determined who would shape the Mediterranean world. Rome emerged not only victorious, but transformed an empire in all but name, destined to expand further, to conquer Greece, Asia, and beyond. But it was Hannibal who had shown Rome its greatest test, who had forced it to evolve, who had made its victory so hard-won that it burned into its memory forever. Rome became Rome because Hannibal nearly destroyed it. And so, in the long arc of history, Hannibal Barca, the man who swore eternal enmity against Rome as a boy, kept his oath. He did not destroy Rome, but he ensured that Rome would never forget him. His shadow lingered long after the smoke of Carthage had faded, a reminder of the day the Republic trembled and of the man who had brought it to the edge of destruction.